All right. Well, welcome Bud Lindstrand to share on one of the classes that he's teaching in one of the local universities here, leading in the knowledge economy. So I'm super excited to hear from Bud.
Okay. Well, thanks, James. You can call them what you want to. I call them cheat sheets.
Okay.
Because by looking here, I know what I want to say. That's very helpful to me. By way of introduction, I live in Bethany, Oregon, which is a suburb of Beaverton, which is a suburb of Portland. And I have learned to tell people I live in Bethany because they always ask me about Portland, and I have very little knowledge of what goes on in the city, even though I worked in downtown Portland for about 40 years. But I have not been down there in a year or more. I pray for the leaders of this city and for the businesses that are there, but I have no interest in going past that. But I did want to talk with you this morning about what I think is a very interesting subject that I teach MBA students, and it's my second favorite course. I love teaching ethics because I think it's the foundation for all of life. But this course, hopefully you'll find interesting. But it is about leadership and leading in that kind of economy where we are now. So I want to take just a minute or two to just refresh us on what is leadership. And I see in leadership three different things. One, there has to be a leader with a vision and ability to align resources to make something happen. And then obviously there have to be followers. There's not much leading if there's nobody following. And then there needs to be a cause, and a worthy cause. And Mike and I were talking about that earlier, that just because we think something is a good cause doesn't necessarily mean that it is. So that's what leadership is. But I also want to remind you that I see a distinct difference between a leader and a manager. A leader is setting a direction, is having, as I said, a vision and ability to align resources to do it. Managing involves the planning and budgeting to make that happen. Secondly, leadership involves aligning those resources. Management involves organizing, staffing, as I said, budgeting and all of that. And then leadership provides motivation, whereas management provides control, solves problems, does all the nitty-gritty work. Now, I want to hasten to add that I see those terms being very mixed up sometimes. And sometimes we use the word leader or leadership in very different ways. Somebody's leading an Awana group in their church. And for me, that's managing it, because that element of vision usually isn't there. They're usually confined to a certain set of rules. But I also would say that in smaller businesses, certainly when I was managing a small business, these two get intermixed. I wore both hats. But it's still important to understand the difference between the two, because there were times when I would set myself aside and really dream about where I wanted to take that business. And then I'd go outside my office door and there was the nitty-gritty that I had to manage. Then as it grew, obviously, then you get people into roles where I wasn't doing much managing anymore. So just a refresher on what we've talked about as leadership. But I want to talk to you about how we get to what I call the knowledge economy, and some of the historical revolutions in our workaday world that have happened, starting with agriculture, the industrial revolution, the service economy, and leading to the knowledge economy. So let's start with agriculture and see how these tie together. As I was telling Mike before we came on, I was born in a little small town. I just remember it as being 1 square mile, and that housed this town, and the town was there solely to service farmers in the areas. And most of the farms were like 40 acres, whatever they called a section, or they had their terminology, but they were all small farms. Now that was in the 1940s. I went back there about 6 or 7 years ago. I hadn't been there probably in 45, 50 years. And not one farm existed. There were no farmhouses. This little town had previously had a railroad track running right through the middle of town, and a granary there, a grain elevator that sat there that sort of defined the town, if you will. Now the town had 2 gigantic elevators. The railroad track no longer went through the middle of town, but those 2 elevators sat there, owned by Cargill. And when I started driving through the town looked just the way I left it. Everything looked great. The house that I remember as a little child had been remodeled, had a big boat sitting in the backyard. So the town was doing fine. And then I began to realize as I drove around looking for things that I thought might be familiar, I didn't see a store in that town. There was not a restaurant in that town. There was not a grocery store in that town. Now, the town was 40 miles by a pretty good road to Grand Forks, North Dakota. And obviously that's where everybody did their shopping. So it was really weird to see the transition from the little farmer being supported by that town, and now the little farmer was gone. So how did the agricultural revolution happen? Well, starting in the 18th century, the threshing machine showed up, and the seed drill showed up, and plowshare showed up. So that changed the way in which planting and tilling the soil and so forth changed. Then you come along to the 19th century and we saw collective farming and the enclosure. Before that, people just kind of farmed a piece of land. But in the 19th century, we saw that formalized and people now begin to own their section of land and have better equipment. Then you get to the 20th century, which now we're talking the 1900s, and the Industrial Revolution starts. Crop rotation now becomes a reality because they begin to learn something about agriculture. You couldn't go to a university 150 years ago and learn about agriculture. They had no knowledge to share with you. But the Industrial Revolution then began to change that. So let's take a look at that. That's in 4 stages, as I see it. The first of these started in 1765 when coal was discovered. That is the use of coal, excuse me, to be able to make things happen with energy. And so the economy moved from agriculture now toward industry because industry used that energy coming from coal. I went to university in Minneapolis when I was a young kid. And I remember after it snowed, by about the second day, the ground was just black because everything was done with coal, even in the mid 20th century. Mechanization resulted in manufactured products. We just take for granted the chair that I'm looking at here. But there's, at some point in the past, you just have to realize there was no equipment to make that chair. People made it out of whatever they made it out of for their own use. And then coal and the development of the steam engine began to change things in the 18th century. The second element of that was when natural gas was discovered and how it could be used much like coal, only more effectively. And that was in the last part of the 19th century. Electricity was found, gas and oil, the invention of the combustion engine and how that changed everything because it brought in the cars and the airplanes to just totally revolutionize the way people lived, and the telegraph and the telephone. I look at my cell phone today and I think about the fact that I can remember as a young child that little town I'm talking about had a central telephone system where you picked up your phone and you called Central, who she was called. And I can remember more than once hearing my mother call and say she wanted so-and-so, and Central would tell her, oh, she's over at such and you want me to ring her over there. That was the telephone. I remember like it was yesterday, our number was 121. How I can remember that, I have no idea. It's just somehow indelible in my mind. And now contrast that with the little cell phone that has several IBM 360s packed into that little bitty space. So you can see how that industrial revolution keeps changing as we go along. The third element of that was when nuclear energy came about. And that, of course, was after World War II, not that long afterward. And electronics came into the picture. And all of that began, by the way, in Europe. And I remember years ago traveling through France on a train. And when one nuclear site went out of sight from behind, you picked up another one in the front. They were that close together. They were just everywhere. So nuclear energy, again, just changed everything. The fourth element is when the internet and renewable energy came in, beginning in the year 2000. Renewable energy and solar and wind, how effective that is, I won't go into or what the future of that is. Nonetheless, it changed something in a lot of ways. We had the acceleration of digital technology. I remember the first cell phone that was like a big paperweight or a big doorstop, if you will. Yeah, just out of sight. And now think about what we have resident in that little phone. The internet has changed all kinds of things in production lines, the Internet of Things, and they always talk about 5G and where the Internet of Things are going. Is fascinating, but all that is a real revolution. And then, of course, AI and the cloud technology. In fact, I think I just got a notice from T-Mobile this morning that said they had expanded yeah, it used to be I'd once in a while, because my wife watches all of her podcasts on her phone, and we'd run out of high speed at some point, and now that's all changed. So that's all about the Industrial Revolution and how people move from the farm. I remember when I was a student in college in Minneapolis, that next door to where I lived was a whole rooming house full of young women who would come in off the farms to work in the city in offices, because all of this revolution is going on. Then we saw the service economy beginning right after World War II. A lot of women had been working in the war effort, and now we're used to working outside the home, and that whole change about women working outside the home. And we saw wages increase somewhat dramatically. I think back now to when I came out of college and what I was earning. I went to work with an advanced degree for $350 a month as a management trainee. How that has all changed so rapidly. We saw the growth, as I said, of women in the marketplace. We saw a growth in prices and the quality of services. There was a time when quality of material that you bought went down. Now we see a resurgence of getting quality equipment, things that will last beyond what they did before. College education grew to 60% by the end of the 20th century. And of course, specialization of skills began to increase. So people would come in and be taught certain skills that were marketable. They could go anywhere and use some of those skills. Here's an interesting graph that I found for 2016. Look at that, 1% of people were working in agriculture. And yet we're doing more agriculture. So it's just fascinating to see how that developed because of these various revolutions, and how now when you go to the area where I mentioned that I had lived, the equipment there that does work in the fields is gigantic, just absolutely gigantic, and can do in an hour what it used to take days, if not weeks, to do. Shows here 19% are working in industry, and 80% are now working in services. And that still continues to fascinate me. Who and what are we serving? Well, it tells you that manufacturing is now done so rapidly and so easily that those people have had to move on from that. It's not just the manufacturing that's gone overseas, that's a factor, but it's just the nature of how things have developed through these various historical revolutions that I've tried to pack into a few minutes here. So then what's the knowledge economy? And I apologize for the fact that I don't have some nice bullet points here, but I thought, I just want to read this, which I've kind of accumulated from a number of sources. An employee is now valued less for the ability to operate a machine than for their specific knowledge of the function of work. Powell and Snellman define the knowledge economy as, quote, production and services based on knowledge, intensive activities that contribute to an accelerated pace of technological and scientific advances, as well as equally rapid obsolescence. Therefore, we see a greater reliance on intellectual capabilities than on physical input or natural resources. Second, efforts to integrate improvements in every stage of the production process. Third, key economic sectors depend more on the generation of knowledge than they did in the past. The new jobs being created are fundamentally different from the old jobs and tend to favor workers who are educated over those with limited education and skills. Now that's a long statement there to kind of try to capture in a broad sense what this knowledge economy is. But what does it look like? And let's just think that through for a few minutes. It's an economy that requires intellectual assets. You're not being asked to come in anymore and just be a drone. You have some intellectual assets that you bring. And I have found that particularly in the areas of technology, young people today are pretty smart and they gain things rather quickly. I was talking here with these fellows before we started about a requirement I had recently to transfer a picture into a PDF. Well, these kids, they would laugh if they knew that it took me 5 minutes to figure that out. Thanks to Google, who told me how to do it. It really was a simple process. So intellectual assets are important. I also was sharing with Mike that I have a grandson who's 17 years old and just bored with school, can't understand why he has to learn a second language, and some of the subjects and some of the profs are just dumb to him. And yet what he wanted for Christmas and he got for Christmas was a kit to build his own computer. And now he will be spending his summer going through some courses or some training on how to do coding. So he's got smarts. This kid, when he tests, he's off the charts with smarts, but he's bored with the typical sort of stuff that we've been taught in school, but he certainly has intellectual assets. Systems have to move away from hierarchical. People do not want to be told, sit down here and do this, and this is the way to do it. Again, I was, as we were talking beforehand here, when I started in the health insurance business, the payments of claims were based on 80% of the bill. So our people would sit there with a hand calculator, put the number in there and pull the handle 8 times to calculate the payment. Now, how subject was that to mistake? I mean, their mind is drifting and you're pulling this 8 times. Well, after a few years, we graduated to where we had an electric one. Now you held the button down and counted 8 clicks from the button. Well, when we hired people, we sat them down to do that. And they did that and they got paid reasonable for it. That doesn't work anymore. You don't go in and say, this is what you do and this is how you do it. The hierarchical downward thrust is no longer there. It requires a total commitment to the ideas of employees. And I will tell you that when I teach strategic planning, one of the things I emphasize over and over and over is whatever your plan is and whatever your vision is, everyone in the organization needs to understand that and see how their role fits into it. I'm not just the guy who puts the wheel on the back right side of a car that's being manufactured. We're making a car here. And I need to understand that and understand not necessarily how to build the engine, but to realize my part in that and how all of this fits together, and to have management be open to the fact that, you know something, I could double my production here if you'd let me put these wheels on this way instead of that way. That's where the intellect and those assets come in to being, but it's so important. I read a statistic some time back, and I should have copied where that was, that 80% of people are unhappy in their work. And I would maintain that that's largely because they do not see how it fits into anything. And they really don't want to be doing something that seems meaningless to them. That's the way my grandson looks at some of the stuff he's being taught in school. What do I need to know this for? It just doesn't make any sense. Realize that employees bring proprietary ideas and some patents. There are actually some companies who will hire people who have some patents, particularly usually in the technology area, and they actually pay them for the use of their patent, as well as for the work that they do. That's what's out there. That's what's going on in the real world today, particularly in larger employers. It matters. It's a matter of building trust, and that's where the sharing of ideas come. I remember there was a management theory out years ago called management by walking around. The idea was you wander around the place and kind of figure out what's going on, try to contribute to that. Before that ever happened, I had long since invented that because I can't stand to sit at a desk. Never was cut out for that. So I would wander around, stop and ask somebody what they were doing and ask them, do you have a better idea on how to do this? Next thing you know, we're over the supervisor's desk and we're talking about how we might change how we do this. And furthermore, now, why do they all have to do it the same way if they get to the same result? It doesn't matter how you do that. You know, maybe I can figure 80% in my head, or maybe I can work in a back quicker than I can your computer thing. The reality is that about half of the claims that we used to do that with now are processed without any human intervention. So there has to be a trust that comes there if the employee will share. When I'd stop at a desk of somebody and asked about that, they knew by what they observed from me all over the place, including my time in the lunchroom, just sitting around talking to people, that they could trust me with their ideas and that they would be honored with those ideas. And therefore, you have to provide a process that builds that kind of trust in management. More of what it looks like, management must maximize worker input. Keep asking those people how to do this better. We were talking earlier about the program called Excel that's in my computer that has so many different issues involved with it that they're just countless. And somebody else is putting something in there new again this week. So you have to maximize the ability for workers to have input on how to do that. There has to be collaboration. Leaders have to respect the workers as working together, that you really respect their ideas. You can't fool them. You either respect them or they'll see through that quickly. And to realize that a real good vision that you're willing to share and able to share builds a lot of trust. So contrary to what we used to call teams as a method of managing, this is really a team atmosphere where everybody is seen as equally important in what they bring. So how do we manage in all of this then? Well, it's obvious here. You have to create the environment where people are willing to share their ideas. They have to understand the big picture, that we're building an automobile here. They have to be treated with respect, to see them as individuals, not people that sit at that desk in that spot doing that job, and introduce different metrics of how you measure what they do. Because the work that I talked about a moment ago was very perfunctory and very easy to measure. As a matter of fact, there was a time probably 25 years ago when I wanted to just put a bunch of computers in a warehouse someplace and tell them, come on in, check in whenever you want to, check out when you want to, and we'll just pay you by the claim. We'll just give you piecework. That's a far cry from what we're talking about here now. So it's important to have the proper kind of metrics as well. So I don't know if I've gone too quickly through that. You want to get the big picture here of how we went going back from when people grubbed in the dirt to these different revolutions in agriculture that sped up the process. And then comes the industrial revolution, which speeds up every process. Then people go in and we begin to get a service economy. And now that's being converted in effect into what we call the knowledge economy, which is where people matter, what they bring to the party beyond just their body really does matter. Sorry that I can't figure a way to get this to you, but what I've given you here are some really important readings that would really enlighten you more, because I don't care what size organization you're operating. This is the real world. This is where people are today. And they will either be unhappy and not as productive as they could be if they're not allowed into the party, or they won't stay. They'll go someplace where they can be respected and where they're, you know, the irony of it is they sit there in that chair and they watch the boss trying to tell them that you have to do it this way. And they're not stupid, but they must think you are if that's the way that they're being treated. I just think, it all goes back to some simple biblical principles, that these people are equally important. And I used to tell my staff that when I'd have an annual dinner where they all came, I would always compliment them on their work. And then I suddenly realized, what is it I do here that really contributes anything? And they know, so why do we play games? These are people who are different people. They're not those same girls that came in off the farms anymore. They are people who are much more enlightened about what's going on in the world around them. And so they bring that level of intelligence that's just different. So hopefully this gives you something to think about. And it is something to think about, but it's coming, and it's coming more and more and more. And we need to be prepared.
Do I ask if they have any questions?
Yeah, any questions? I'd be glad to try to think them through with you.
Yeah, but can you hear me okay? This is Mike Hudspeth.
Yeah.
So this may be a little on track and a little off. How different do you see us as a workforce as it relates to shift in industry over decades? You talked about, going from agriculture to services predominantly the last 5 years. I think most everybody has heard the millennials and kind of a force to be reckoned with. But how much of that is really different and how much of it is we are people at the end of the day, and there's a leadership element that's constant and a management process that's constant through all of it.
No, Mike, I don't think it's any different, except I don't think a lot of management people see things that way. I know that 40 years ago, I saw those people as worthy to be respected. Their ideas were worthy to be considered. This is a little bit different because here the tendency more is to just turn them loose. And I never saw how I could really do that, but I'm not out in that real world today to see how you do that. But to me, you always want to capture the best in people, but it also, as we move into this sort of managing, we get away from the fact that people don't like their job. They're eager to go to work because they're respected. They have an idea, they can share that idea and see it either get implemented or reasons being given why it shouldn't be. At least it's thought through and given consideration. I think that's different. And I'm not sure there's a lot of managers out there that really understand that there's a change here in the people they're hiring. Interestingly, I think this last year makes that even more vivid because now we're realizing, in fact, I've wondered, and I've been thinking about going downtown asking my old company, are you going to continue to rent space? Because 80% of the work you're done, they don't need to come down here and get in an office. They haven't been doing it for a year. Why do they need to do it in the future? They've just got their 2 screens in front of them on a desk. They can do that at home just as well. And if you pay them on a little different basis, it's even more, there's more flexibility to it. So again, I just think it's more in how do we manage this than it is any real change. People have always had a good mind. They've just never felt free to express it. Now you can't keep them from expressing it, or they'll go straight away.
Are there any studies that show a difference in tolerance in the workforce? Is it a lower tolerance on sort of the measurement of I like my job or I hate my job versus what it used to be?
I can't cite for you any specific database for that, but there are a couple of these articles that really go into that 7 C's of knowledge leadership that do have some data to demonstrate that these people are happier people. They really do contribute something. And for crying out loud as a boss, if those 2 things aren't important to me, my business isn't going to thrive in this world. But yeah, no, there have been studies done to show employee satisfaction changes where, I mean, look at some of these companies where innovation is about everything. Microsoft and places like that flourish on that. Intel has these people they call fellows that just sit around all day and do nothing but dream up things. I guess. I know a couple of them. I'm not convinced they do anything, but that's what they get paid a healthy amount of money for. And
thanks, bud.
Just common sense tells me that if we take these people in our confidence and turn them loose, what do we got to lose? As long as we have good metrics.
Yeah, good point.
So I wanted to ask, as we're talking about the marketplace or economy sphere of influence, if you were going to take a look at the education sphere of influence, Bud, what kind of changes need to be done in college and university curriculum that would help, as we're talking about the knowledge economy, we're talking about them being able to generate and connect at the level of information. What other kinds of things do you see that need to change in colleges and universities to support this? And I'm thinking about that in terms of not just head knowledge, writing a paper, passing an exam, but what they would need hands-on, specifically in the business world.
Then that's a fascinating question. I serve on a board of trustees of a university, and in fact was on a virtual meeting, a board meeting last week, where I saw that they were bringing forward some changes in the core curriculum. And fundamental, but education doesn't get it. They really don't get it. They seem to think that they need to drive this pony wherever they think it needs to go. But what I did see, and this was a Christian university, what I did see was they opened up more time for electives. And I see some universities allowing you to create your own major. Now, that's dangerous without some pretty good oversight, because some of the majors that universities already offer, let alone some kids would dream up, are rather useless. And yet I look at this grandson of mine, who I don't know whether he'll get to college, because he'll get a flat F on a course in high school because he just doesn't believe he ought to be taking it. And so somehow education has got to be responsive to this. And yet to me, they've proven throughout my lifetime that they're the ones that are not leading the thing here. They're the ones following, trying to figure it out. And that's tragic, because this young man he'll be like a Bill Gates somewhere along the line.
Wow.
But you can get a lot of formal education.
See, hey, awesome. That's awesome. I agree. I wanted to ask you, as you're talking about, as you're meeting one-on-one with the employees, how can you do this differently? What might this look like? Then if you were going to build around that idea of collaboration, of brainstorming ideas and getting it from the employees, do you have a model that you could share with us, or an example of a time when you saw this, where the team came together and then they sparked off each other, they did the brainstorming thing, and then that kind of opened up steps for the next phase for that business?
No, I did not do that. And I'm just kind of hesitant to even respond to the group getting together. What I found worked very successfully was, because the employees knew this and they knew they were respected by me, they trusted me. And so they thought nothing of it when I pulled up a chair alongside of just an average worker and began to talk to them. Or if they'd see me in the lunchroom sitting around a table with 3-4 people that were doing different kinds of levels of jobs all over the place, and I'm sitting there talking to them about what we really want to do here as a company, who I believe we are and who we want to be. So for me, it was very informal, but it all comes back to that trust thing. There was never anybody that wondered when I sat down in the middle of 30 people in a department. They knew what I was doing, because I probably had been one of their desks 6 months ago. So it all comes back to that trust. If trust is not there, now sometimes I can see an opportunity for getting people into a room and saying, we've got something new happening here. We've got an order for something that had nothing to do with anything we've done. Let's get some ideas out here on how we're going to do that. And by the way, the only way for me to handle a meeting like that, and I did that whenever we had problems to solve with my senior management people, I always came in with an answer to the problem, put it up on the whiteboard and just said, attack this. Tell me where I'm wrong here. But to come into a room with a group of people and say, we got to figure something out, to me, that's wasted time. Let's at least get a plan up there, destroy it if you want, change it, but at least we've got something to work with, not just a bunch of ideas that come out of our head when we walk in.
So good. When you were sharing about the power of the one-on-one, that led me to think about discipleship, and the power of the one-on-one instead of the large group. And so I had recently connected via Zoom call with a member of somebody who was at Salem events that were praying forward Reformation for the state of Oregon, with someone who was leading a statewide event in Colorado. And on this Zoom call, I was sure they're going to be talking about the large corporate picture, what God was doing to take through the spheres of influence, or the big picture. But they both settled in on the same topic, and it was the power of the one-on-one, that power of talking and listening one-on-one. And that, they said, was where the big change was going to occur. So even as you were sharing about putting this one idea up on the board, attack it, like let's put our heads together for this. Still, I found it fascinating that other leaders have come back to the same conclusion about the power of discipleship.
Well, and that's interesting, Lynn, because my motivation in life is found in Matthew 28, where I'm told by Jesus himself to go and make disciples. He never gave me any other instruction. There's a lot about how to live and not live in the New Testament. But what I saw in those one-on-one things was also an opportunity to say, by the way, how are you doing? Are things good? Because an awful lot of people that came to work had problems before they ever got there. And they weren't problems I could solve, other than, again, by trust and encouragement. And sometimes people would actually say, I'm not doing well. I had to take my child to the hospital last night or whatever. And it gave me opportunity to say, then you get your hinder out of here and you get over to that hospital. You don't belong here. So discipleship from the biblical standpoint just opens up hugely, because it is about trust. It's about me trusting in God and people trusting in me. Mike and James trust me to stand here and talk to you because we shared ideas and we know that it's all about the kingdom. It's all about the kingdom.
Well, but I got one final question, and it's that last bullet there on important readings. And that was my question, was what's next after the knowledge economy? And there you've got a book saying from the knowledge economy to the human economy. What is that book about?
Well, I confess I've not actually read that one,
Okay,
but I know it comes back to what we've just been talking about.
exactly.
That it's about people.
It's people.
I mean, it would be easy in the knowledge economy to say we want to capture their brain,
Right.
but what about who they are?
Yeah.
And I can't tell you how many, I had so many people working for me that were single moms or had a husband, but it was not really a husband. And I knew they had all kinds of problems. I could tell when I talked to somebody early that they'd had some kind of a huge difficulty that morning. And so that's where, as a believer, you have the opportunity to get into their life,
Exactly.
not just their brain, because that's so critical. And I'll tell you something, if you want a good worker, you want somebody who's settled. You don't want somebody who's chewing on some fight they had with their husband last night and he slugged them and things like that.
Awesome. Thank you.